Hi there, and thanks for taking the time to watch this short training video. This presentation is called Invisible Triggers, Why Some Behaviours Don't Make Sense Until You Look Closer. What we are going to focus on today is understanding the unseen factors that influence behaviour. So these are the things that sit underneath what we actually see on the surface. In my work as a behaviour analyst, one of the things I hear most often from staff and parents is, "It just came out of nowhere." You know the kind of moment I mean. When a child who seemed completely fine suddenly becomes upset, refuses a task, or reacts in a way that feels unpredictable. But behaviour is never random. It always serves a purpose. It is a form of communication, a message about what the child is experiencing or what they need in that moment. Sometimes that message is easy to spot, and other times it is buried under layers of emotion, environmental factors, or past experiences. So what I want to do in this session is to take a step back and look beneath the surface of behaviour. We will explore what these invisible triggers are, how they connect to the function of behaviour, and also how understanding them can help us respond more effectively and support children in meaningful and evidence-based ways. So, to begin setting the scene, when I visit schools or work directly with families, I'm never just looking at what a child is doing in that moment. I'm paying attention to everything that's happening around them, and that includes things such as the environment, the people, the routines, the expectations, and even the energy in the room, because behaviour doesn't happen in isolation. Children don't just act out, they respond. They respond to what's around them, what they're feeling, and what they've learned works for them based on their previous experiences. The challenge is that we often only see the end result, which is the behaviour itself. What we don't always see are the things that have built up and combined to influence that behaviour. If you look at the visual on the screen, you'll see that behaviour doesn't come from a single cause. There are several contributing factors, which I've shown here as factor A, B, and C, all feeding into the behaviour we eventually see. Each of those factors could represent something different. For one child, it might be sensory sensitivity. For another, it could be social pressure, emotional stress, or even something simple like tiredness or hunger. The key point to mention here is that behaviour is the result of multiple influences interacting together rather than one isolated event. So when we're trying to understand behaviour, we need to widen our perspective. Instead of focusing only on what the child did, we start asking what was happening around them, what might have been building up throughout the day, and what experiences they might be bringing into that moment. That's how we start to move from reacting to behaviour to truly understanding it. Now that we've set the scene and thought about the many factors that contribute to behaviour, let's move on to the next slide and look at what we usually see on the surface, the part that tends to grab our attention first. When we talk about behaviour, we are usually describing what is visible, things like calling out, refusing work, walking away, or getting upset. That is the surface level, the part that everyone can see. But what I have learned through observation and analysis is that behaviour is more like an iceberg. The visible part above the surface is just a small fraction of the whole picture. Beneath the surface sits everything else that shapes what we see, including the emotions, the sensory experiences, the social dynamics, and all the learning history that a child brings with them. If you look at the image on the screen, you can see the idea clearly. The tip of the iceberg represents the outward behaviour, the thing we notice first and often react to. But below the surface are all the unseen elements that influence that behaviour. Things such as how safe a child feels, their sense of identity, their emotional state, and the beliefs or experiences that shape how they respond to the world around them. The key point to mention here is that what we see is only one small part of the story. When we focus only on that visible, we end up reacting to behaviour instead of understanding it. But when we take time to look beneath the surface, we start to see patterns. We begin to recognise why behaviour happens and what it is really communicating. Once we start to understand that, we can respond differently. We can move from trying to control behaviour to supporting it in a more thoughtful and informed way. So now that we have thought about what we can see above the surface, let's move into the next slide and explore what is happening underneath. These are the invisible factors that often go unnoticed but play a major role in shaping what we see. Now let's think about what is often invisible when it comes to behaviour. Invisible triggers are the things that influence behaviour without being obvious. These are the factors that sit underneath what we see on the surface and often explain why a child reacts in a particular way. They can be sensory, emotional, social, or physiological. For example, a sensory trigger might be too much noise in the classroom, bright lighting, or uncomfortable clothing. An emotional trigger could be frustration, worry, or fear of failure. A social trigger might involve feeling excluded, embarrassed, or under pressure to perform in front of others. And sometimes the trigger is physiological, such as hunger, tiredness, or even a headache that the child might not be able to communicate. If you look at the table on the screen, you can see how these different types of invisible triggers can show up in real settings. On the left are the categories of triggers, and on the right are examples of how each might appear in practice. It's a simple way to remind ourselves that what seems like one behaviour can actually be shaped by many different internal or external factors working together. Sometimes a child is not even aware of what is happening for them. Their body reacts before their brain has had time to process what is wrong. That is why behaviour can seem sudden or unpredictable. The key point to mention here is that there is always a reason for behaviour, even if we can't see it right away. Once we start to recognise that, we stop asking, why did they do that? And start asking, what might have happened for them just before this? That small shift in thinking changes everything about how we approach behaviour. It moves us away from blame and towards understanding. Now that we have looked at some of these invisible triggers, let's move into the next slide and talk about how we can link what we see to the function of behaviour. This helps us understand not only what set the behaviour of, but also what keeps it going. Now that we have looked at what some of the invisible triggers might be, I want to link that to one of the most important ideas in behaviour analysis, which is the function of behaviour. Every behaviour serves a purpose. It does something for the person. This is a core principle within behaviour analysis, and it helps us understand behaviour in a much clearer and more objective way. If you look at the table on the screen, you can see the four main functions that we consider when analysing behaviour. These are attention, escape or avoidance, access to tangibles, and sensory or automatic reinforcement. The first function I want to talk about is attention. This is when behaviour happens because it gains a social reaction or interaction from others. That could be positive attention, such as praise, or negative attention, such as being told off. Either way, the behaviour is being reinforced because it gets a response. For example, a child might call out during a lesson because they know it guarantees attention from an adult. The second function I want us to look at is escape or avoidance. This happens when behaviour allows a child to avoid or delay something they find uncomfortable or difficult. It might be a challenging task, a noisy environment, or an instruction they do not want to follow. For instance, a child might refuse a writing task because it feels overwhelming or because fine motor skills are difficult for them. The third function is access to tangibles or preferred activities. This is when behaviour helps the child get something they want, such as a toy, a turn, or access to a preferred activity. You might see this when a child repeatedly asks for something or grabs an item because they cannot wait. And lastly, the fourth function is sensory or automatic reinforcement. This is when the behaviour itself provides stimulation or relief. There is no external reward maintaining it because the reinforcement comes from within. For example, a child might rock, hum, or fidget because it helps them stay calm or to feel regulated. The key point to mention here is that when we understand the function of behaviour, we stop labelling it as good or bad. We begin to see it for what it really is, purposeful and efficient. The child is doing what works for them in that moment to meet a need. Understanding function helps us respond in a way that supports the child rather than punishes the behaviour. It also helps us identify what skills they might need to learn instead. Now, to understand how these functions fit together in practice, we need to think about what happens before and after the behaviour. This is where the ABC model comes in, and we will look at that next. Now that we've looked at the function of behaviour, I want to show you how we can start identifying it in practice. The ABC model is one of the most effective frameworks we use in behaviour analysis to understand what is happening in real settings. ABC simply stands for antecedent, behaviour, and consequence. The antecedent is what happens immediately before the behaviour. It sets the stage for the behaviour to occur. This could be an instruction, a sensory experience, or a social interaction. The behaviour is what we actually observe. It is the specific action or response that the child shows. And the consequence is what happens immediately after the behaviour. It is the event that either increases or decreases the likelihood of that behaviour happening again in the future. If you look at the table on the screen, you can see how this works in practice. It breaks down each component clearly. On the left is the function, in the middle, the description, and on the right, an example of what that might look like in a real classroom. Let's go through one example together. Let's imagine a teacher gives a writing task. The child refuses, pushes the book away, and the adult removes the work to avoid a scene. In this case, the antecedent is the writing task, the behaviour is the refusal, and the consequence is the work being taken away. That consequence reinforces the behaviour because it works for the child. The task is removed. When we analyse behaviour in this way, we start to notice patterns. We can see exactly what is maintaining the behaviour and begin teaching alternative responses that achieve the same function in a more appropriate way. The key point to mention here is that the ABC model gives us clarity. It helps us move from guessing to understanding. We stop reacting emotionally and start responding systematically. Now that we have broken down what happens before and after behaviour, let's bring this together with what we already know about invisible triggers. When we combine those two perspectives, the picture becomes much clearer and far more useful for planning support. When we look at both invisible triggers and the function of behaviour together, that is when things really start to make sense. If you look at the visual on the screen, you can see two circles that overlap. One represents triggers and the other represents function. The space in the middle is where understanding happens. This is the point where everything connects and behaviour starts to make sense rather than feeling unpredictable. To give you an example from a home setting, I once worked with a family who found that their child became very distressed every morning when it was time to leave the house. On the surface, it looked like avoidance or oppositional behaviour. The child would refuse to get dressed, sometimes hide their shoes, and even shout at their parent. But when I spent time observing and speaking with the family, a very different picture emerged. The behaviour wasn't really about school or defiance. The pattern showed that it always happened when the family were running late, voices were raised, and there was a sense of rushing. The trigger was anxiety linked to unpredictability and noise. The function was control. The behaviour gave the child a sense of control over a situation that felt chaotic and overwhelming. Once we understood that, the focus shifted. Instead of managing the outburst, the family created a calmer routine with a clear visual sequence for mornings. They built in an earlier start time, so there were less rushing, and gave the child a small job to do each morning to give them ownership and predictability. The behaviour reduced dramatically because the child's need for control and predictability was being met in a more positive way. The key point to mention here is that when we understand both the triggers and the function, we move from reacting to behaviour to actually meeting the need underneath it. We are no longer managing behaviour in the moment, we are reducing the likelihood of it happening in the first place. So now that we've seen how powerful this understanding can be in practice, let's move into the next slide and think about how you can start spotting some of these invisible triggers within your own setting. So now that we have looked at how triggers and functions work together, let's talk about how we can actually start identifying those invisible triggers in practice. Spotting invisible triggers starts with slowing down and observing patterns. It is about taking a step back and being curious rather than reactive. When behaviour happens, take a moment to think about what was going on just before. What was the environment like? Who was present? What was the task? What was the child's emotional or physical state? I thought I would include the picture of the person with a magnifying glass here because that is exactly what we need to do as practitioners. We need to become detectives of behaviour, looking carefully at what surrounds it, not just what we can see on the surface. Over time, when we start to observe consistently, we begin to see clear links. You might notice that certain behaviours happen at the same time each day, during specific activities or in particular environments. That is not a coincidence. That is your data telling a story. You do not need complex tools to do this. Simple ABC charts or quick notes can make a real difference. The key here is consistency. The more information that we collect, the clearer the picture becomes. I think the key point to mention here is that once we can identify the conditions under which behaviour is most likely to occur, we can begin to prevent it rather than react to it. And that actually is where proactive practice really begins. So now that we have explored how to identify triggers, let's move on to the next part and talk about how we can respond to them effectively once we know what they are. Now that we have explored how to identify invisible triggers, let's think about how we can respond to them effectively. When we understand the triggers, we can make targeted changes that reduce the likelihood of certain behaviours happening. This is where small adjustments can make a big difference. If a child struggles with noise, we might reduce sensory overload by providing quieter workspaces or using ear defenders. If transitions are difficult, we can give clear countdowns or use visual supports to make the change predictable. And if social situations create anxiety, we can build in structure and predictability so that the child knows what to expect and feels safe in that environment. I included the visual of people holding puzzle pieces here because I think it captures this idea perfectly. Each piece represents an important part of the puzzle, whether that is the environment, the teaching, the relationships, or the emotional support. When those pieces fit together, behaviour begins to make sense and meaningful change becomes possible. Another key part of responding effectively is teaching replacement behaviours that meet the same function as the original behaviour. For example, if a child is avoiding a task, we can teach them to ask for a break. If they are seeking attention, we can model and reinforce appropriate ways to ask for it, such as raising their hand or using a help card. The key point to mention here is that this is where behaviour support becomes behaviour teaching. We are not simply managing behaviour in the moment, we are teaching new skills that will last beyond that moment. When adults respond calmly, consistently, and predictably, those new skills start to stick. Over time, that consistency builds trust, and trust leads to real behaviour change. Now that we have thought about how to respond and teach proactively, let's move into the next slide and think about how this changes the way we see behaviour as a whole. Once we start thinking in this way, our entire approach to behaviour begins to change. Behaviour stops being about control and starts being about understanding. What might look like defiance or attitude often makes perfect sense once we understand what is driving it. I like this visual of a person sitting and thinking because I think it captures this moment perfectly. Reflection is what allows us to pause, step back, and really think about what is going on beneath the surface. It reminds us that we do not always need to act straight away. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is reflect before we respond. And I think this is where the biggest shift happens for staff. Instead of frustration, we start to feel curiosity. Instead of reacting, we start to analyse. We begin to ask better questions about what the child is communicating rather than focusing on how that communication looks. The important point to mention here is that when we shift our thinking from what is wrong with them to what is happening for them, it completely changes the way we interact with children. It changes the tone of our responses, the strategies we choose, and the relationships we build. So before we close, let's take a moment to pull everything together and think about what this means for our practice moving forward. As we finish up, let's remember that every behaviour has meaning. Let's also remind ourselves that some triggers are easy to spot while others are invisible. But just because they are invisible doesn't mean that they're not always there. When we take time to slow down, look beneath the surface, and connect what we see to what we know about function, behaviour becomes predictable and teachable. It stops feeling random and starts to make sense. I like the image of the two people connecting a plug, and I think it captures exactly what this presentation focus has been about. When we connect understanding with practice, everything starts to work together. We create real connections with the children we support. Our job is not to eliminate behaviour. It is to understand it and to help children learn safer, more effective ways to meet their needs. When we do that consistently, we create classrooms and environments that are calmer, more trusting, and more emotionally intelligent. Thank you for watching and taking the time to think about this topic today. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me below.